Today's episode of the Sustainability Scope is brought to you by AM Custom Clothing, a wholesale provider of sustainable printed and embroidered clothing for businesses, bands and brands.
Welcome to the Sustainability Scope, the show that gives you bite-sized facts and chats about all things sustainability. I'm Alex.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to talk about all things fair trade.
So I guess we should start today's chat talking about what fair trade actually is, because I think most people are probably quite familiar with the fair trade name and the fair trade logo. And we've probably almost all of us bought fair trade products, but we possibly don't quite understand what the fair trade logo means when it's on your bananas or your chocolate or something like that, do we?
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume it certifies everything in the supply chain, and that means like the factory is certified, the farm is certified, like every bit of it is like good. But
yeah, I think for most people, they probably just think they see the logo, it's good, and that's why they buy it. Which to some degree is the entire purpose of having a logo like that, because it makes it easy to be able to see at a glance that something is in some way, and we'll get onto how, better for something in the supply chain, without having to go and do a load of research every time you want to buy a different brand of chocolate or coffee or something like that. So I guess, what is it? What does it mean? And who decides what it goes on?
Yes. Mike, I'll let you start with what is it, as I know what's your remit.
You are very kind.
Yeah.
So the fair trade kind of movement has been around for quite some time, but it's kind of different in different places. So in the UK, there is an organisation called the Fair Trade Foundation, which is the organisation that kind of owns the trademark to fair trade in the UK, and they're the people who decide what gets to be certified as fair trade. Most of the stuff or all of the stuff, in fact, that their logo goes on is stuff that can be grown or, in very few cases, mined, like gold, for example. And basically what the certification means is that the people who are in the process of involved in the process, of growing a crop in some way are paid fairly, paid a minimum that's kind of set by the fair trade movement, and on top of that there is what they call the fair trade premium, which is, I don't have the figures on the top of my head, but is a certain amount of money per quantity of goods that are purchased, and that is supposed to be used to fund social projects. So, for example, building a school, or like installing water somewhere, or easy access to potable water, something like that. The minimum, and we'll come on to it possibly a little bit later, is there to kind of stop farmers being ripped off by larger organizations that are buying their crops. Often they get paid more. Well, almost always they get paid more than this minimum, but the minimum's there as a way to kind of guarantee that they get at least something.
Yeah, it's like the minimum or the market rate, isn't it? Depending on which is higher.
Yeah, exactly. So say the minimum is set for, and I'm just going to pick some random figures here, so please nobody kind of say, oh, that's not how much you pay for coffee. Let's say a ton of coffee costs $10,000 on the market. I have no idea whether that's correct. It's probably a million miles out, but let's say it's that, and the fair trade amount is set at $5,000 per ton. If the market rate drops to 6,000, the farmer will still receive 6,000, but if it drops to 4, then the fair trade coffee will still be bought at least $5,000 per ton. So that's basically what it is, what it goes on, and how it works. But there's often a little bit of confusion, I think, isn't there, about other things that fair trade can mean? Like, Is it organic? No. Does it mean that it's kind of 100% sustainable, made from recycled materials or something like that? Well, to be honest, I don't think I want my bananas to be recycled.
No, and arguably, I think to that note, there's often this perception that fair trade is about the environment, but it's more about the kind of people
Yes.
as opposed to the environment. They've got certain like rules, like you can't cut down rainforests to like create your farm or whatever.
Yeah.
So there is some minimal protection, but for the most part, they give them the kind of tools to better understand how to like farm sustainably. But if they don't want to do that, you can still be fair trade, because you're still, getting that premium.
Yeah, I
that you
mean,
mentioned.
as long as they meet the minimum standards, the
Yeah.
minimum standards are higher than not fair trade.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
And at the same time, the requirements for being sustainable are also about protecting the workers involved. Because if you're using ridiculously dangerous chemicals or working practice, the people that you're supposedly treating fairly are not going to be treated fairly for very long. So that's the entire point.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, the clue is in the name, isn't it? It's called fair trade. And it is about trading fairly.
Yeah, so I guess to that, you kind of, you want to look for fair trade, but I guess if you can, you probably want to do some research into the brand that you're buying from to make sure they're doing other things as well to ensure every part of that supply chain is a little bit better. Okay, shall we talk a little bit, I guess, next about what products are fair trade?
Yeah, I think you've got a sizable list there, haven't you?
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know what products are fair trade, we'll give you the full list. So bananas, cocoa, coffee, flowers, sugar, tea. I think those are probably the most notable ones anyway. Then there's things like cotton, that can be fair trade certified, fruits and juices, herbs and spices, honey, nuts and oils, quinoa, rice, vegetables, wine, gold, so it goes back to your mining. Sports balls, which is an interesting one.
Sports balls?
Yeah, so like footballs.
Did not know that.
I didn't either. I think I saw a video yesterday about like football and fair trade, which is interesting. Textiles, which kind of relates somewhat to cotton. Carbon, didn't know that either.
No.
And then composites.
Right.
So that's the full list.
For the very large part, it is stuff that can be grown in the ground on a tree, something like that, rather than, say, something that can be manufactured in a factory synthetically. Okay, so there's quite a wide range of products there. So there's almost a guarantee that anybody listening to this, if they live in a developed nation, they're most likely to have bought, particularly in the UK, I'd say, because it is so prevalent here, isn't it? They're almost certainly, even if they've done it by accident, bought a product that has the fair trade logo on it. But in the UK, the fair trade name is obviously protected by the Fair Trade Foundation. But there are people, and we've seen it in our line of work, haven't we, where there will be people who will try to get around that by just slightly changing the way that they word fair trade. So instead of, because in the UK, fair trade is one word, fair trade, with no spaces. Whereas some people will try to say that it's fair space trade, or even describe what they're selling as fairly traded.
Yeah, there is also the fair trade certification, but it's fair space trade certification, which is another thing. So I think that's
just not for the UK, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it can be a little bit confusing because the movement, as they call it, the fair trade movement, is a bit of a confederation almost, in the sense that each country or each region has its own kind of rules and body that polices it. But here in the UK particularly, we see a mix of everything of those words, where people try to get around it, maybe pass products off as more sustainable or good than they actually are.
Yeah, I think the other issue is, again, possibly people don't look into, on a website, again, in our line of work, we've seen it, where someone will put the fair trade label on the footer of their website to say they're fair trade, or in
Because
nab at
they
the
do
bottom.
legitimately have a fair trade product, at least
Yeah,
one.
yeah, at least one. And then it could be that you're looking at, let's say, I don't know, a high-vis vest or a water bottle that's made of plastic, and you've got all these things in a
Yeah.
footer that say it's fair trade, or not it's fair trade, but they're fair trade. You might then jump to the
Yeah.
conclusion that that product is fair trade, when ultimately it's, as we've seen it, it'll be something made from a synthetic material that could not possibly be
Yeah.
fair trade.
Well, and yeah, as we know, there isn't a farm somewhere in like Central America growing plastic bottles or something like that.
No, exactly. So I think it's important if you're looking to buy fair trade, that it's the product that's
Yes.
certified, not just on a
So,
website banner.
particularly if you're in the UK, and the same will apply to other countries. You just have to look up what the logo and certifying body is in your country. But particularly in the UK, look for products specifically that have on the packaging, or if it's on a website, it's in the description of that particular product, the Fair Trade Foundation logo. And if that's there, then you can be confident that it does actually have the Fair Trade certification.
Yes.
So another thing to kind of just talk about, and let's be honest, the reason why there is an incentive for private businesses to include a fair trade logo on their product is because it can help them to sell more of whatever their wares are. Now, that I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because there is clearly growing demand from individual consumers and from businesses to make sure that the products that they buy are more sustainable. And therefore, as we've already touched upon, the fair trade logo is one way of doing that quite quickly and easily, because you see it, you recognize it, you know that it's doing some good, and therefore that's what you want to buy. But it isn't necessarily the ultimate solution or the only solution. It isn't a replacement for, say, charities. You can't get rid of consumer guilt or something like that just by buying something that's like a piece of fair trade gold jewelry, for example. You haven't gone, if you dropped, and it's just a random number, £100 on a fair trade ring, you haven't donated £100 to charity. You bought yourself £100 ring, and a small portion of that has gone to helping a miner somewhere that's mined the gold. So it's important to recognize that it's definitely better than not buying it, but it isn't a replacement for, say, charity.
Yeah, and I guess coming back to that point about people using it for, I don't know, PR or to sell stuff, again, I guess it doesn't matter too much, does it? As long as in the end some good's done. But the reason,
yeah, I mean, ultimately, the way I see that is if there wasn't demand for people wanting to do good and wanting to spend their money more wisely, then there would be no need for fair trade at all, because people would simply say, well, why am I spending more money on something just because of this logo?
Yeah.
And we'll come on to the criticisms of fair trade and what it doesn't do in a second. But I think that's quite an important point, because some people will be very cynical about not just fair trade, but all kinds of sustainability claims on products. The reality is nothing is a silver bullet. Nothing is the single solution. But the more small steps that we can take in the right direction, the better.
Yeah, and I guess consumers are the ones that dictate what's on the shelves, which is funny. We assume that it's the brands that are deciding, but it's the consumers. Like, if the consumers want fair trade and they're only buying fair trade, the brands have to do it. They've got to deliver on it.
Exactly.
And sustainability has to happen, which we're seeing more and more of. Like, people are now shouting about sustainability a lot more so than they ever have, and it's because there's the demand there for it. So I guess, yeah, it makes sense.
No, absolutely. So shall we talk about the criticisms of fair trade? Because I think it's perhaps fair that we cover both sides of the argument.
Yeah, I think one of the I guess not a criticism necessarily of fair trade, but a criticism of just maybe buying fair trade products instead of other ones is that I think a lot of brands will buy products from things that aren't necessarily fair trade certified, but are certified by things like Rainforest Alliance or maybe other certifying bodies. And when they have a big supply chain, a good example of this is Innocent Smoothies. Having looked on their website, they have an FAQ question where it's, why don't you certify all of your ingredients to one standard like the Rainforest Alliance or fair trade? And their reasoning is fairly valid, and it's that they're buying ingredients from all over the world, from thousands of different farms, and they're all different shapes and sizes, so no single scheme like fair trade would cover every single one, and restricting it to just one certification would really limit, firstly, what they could buy, where they could buy it from, and it may force farmers into schemes that that isn't necessarily beneficial for them. So by having more of a broader approach, they can buy from lots more different people, have a more resilient supply chain, I guess. And it actually is possibly better for everyone involved than necessarily going for one like silver bullet that is fair trade. Yeah, they could stick a stamp on it and it would make people possibly feel a bit better. But actually, ultimately, they possibly have a more sustainable approach in that broader outlook.
It's not a criticism of fair trade per se. It's the fact that it recognises it has limitations, and therefore they need to use other tools as well to really ultimately achieve their goals.
Exactly, and they do mention that they are buying from fair trade farms and Rainforest Alliance farms. So they're still buying and paying that premium and helping fair trade, but they're just not able to stick the stamp on their product because it's not all fair trade certified. So problematic from a marketing point of view, possibly, but ultimately what they're doing is good. So it's a little bit less restrictive, and I think you'll find that in lots of different products where they're buying from different things or different certified brands and mixing it together. I guess particularly in food products, it's a little bit more difficult than, let's say, bananas, where it's just a banana.
Yeah, it's literally just one product and that's it.
Exactly. I guess another kind of point to that is pay is kind of relative, and I think that's a tricky one. So we've seen in our industry, again, you'll see someone say, "Oh, this person has been paid X in a factory," and you look at it, and someone in the Western world would be like, "Oh my gosh, that's shocking," but actually, it's possibly quite good for there. And then there's the caveat that if it's a factory, you can't pay one person one thing and another person a different thing in the factory. You've got to go to their living wage or whatever the minimum is. You can't start paying Western amounts.
No, precisely. Riots. And I mean, it's too long to talk about today, but that's where the Big Mac index comes in, isn't it? Where it's like the buying power in each country varies. So whilst absolutely there are places that are paying far below what they should be, that's why some of the organisations that are kind of an addition to fair trade, they focus on a local living wage rather than like the legal minimum wage, because even in like developed countries like the US and even sometimes here in the UK, the minimum wage is not really enough. So yeah, it's important to kind of put it into context. I had to dig the book out from the back of a shelf because it's been a long time since I picked it up, but I actually did my dissertation on this entire topic when I was at uni. So this book was quite useful whilst I was doing that. And the book that I'm kind of going to just summarize a little bit here is called Fair Trade, with a space between the fair and the trade. Fair Trade Without the Froth, a dispassionate economic analysis of fair trade. It's written by someone called Sushil Mohan. I apologize if I've butchered that name. But it kind of talks about a lot of the things we already talked about, and I won't go into too much detail, but it's an analysis of, because some people who are really against fair trade kind of see it as this anti-capitalist, anti-free trade movement, and the reality is it isn't really that at all. It sits instead within the capitalist free trade kind of movement, because at the end of the day, you have choice. You can either buy something that's fair trade certified, or you can choose not to. and that's the entire point of free trade itself. But some of the criticisms that are included in this book, mainly around, like, say, the guaranteed minimum price that we talked about earlier, is that, yes, let's say, and I used the example before of $10,000 for a ton of coffee. If the fair trade minimum price is 5,000, but the market price drops to 4, anyone buying fair trade coffee will still have to pay 5. That's correct. But what the book argues is that what we don't know, because that minimum is quite low and is almost always been below the market value, what we don't know is if the value drops below the minimum, will companies stop buying as much fair trade products from the farmers because they're looking to save money? Because at the moment, the reality is they only have to pay the social premium. There isn't really a markup on the actual product itself. There may be a small premium just based on buying, like, demand and supply, but it's a little bit untested. Another criticism actually is that it doesn't focus on the absolute poorest countries. Rather, the places where you will get your fair trade materials from tends to be middle income countries, and part of that comes down to another criticism that was in the book, is that you obviously have to have a certification for being fair trade. And I mean, when was this book written? This book was written in, I think, about 2011, something like that, 2010. So it's over a decade old now, but they were saying that the minimum cost of getting certified is about £1,750. Sorry, £1,570.
And that's the farmer that has to be certified.
Yes. So I'll quote this entire sentence. The certification charge starts at £1,570 in the first year, a huge sum of money for producers in the poorest countries. So I mean, it could be that it's passed down. I don't know. I don't know enough about that part. If you are the company that is buying the goods, maybe you're willing to pay that. I don't know. But
yeah, to help them become fair trade certified, if you're happy with the supply chain, I guess maybe that is something you're willing to contribute to.
Yes, exactly.
To help yourself and them.
Exactly. And much of the other criticisms are what we've already kind of talked about already. It's not the only kind of it's not the only solution. Potentially you could achieve more by going down different routes. But I think overall, if we kind of wrap today up, I think the reality is fair trade is not bad. Fair trade is good.
Yeah.
It isn't the ultimate solution to all of the world's problems, but it's a solution to the very specific problems that it sets out to address. Does it fix them entirely? No. Is it perfect? No. But is it probably one of the best solutions that we have in that regard? Probably. And part of that is not just about how efficacious it is in delivering social improvements for people at the very bottom end of the supply chain, but it's also in the fact that it can achieve those things more regularly. If I have to go and do 2 hours of research into a manufacturer every time I want to buy a bar of chocolate, I'm not going to do it. The reality is I don't have the time, and I'm interested in this sort of stuff. So Joe Bloggs off the street, who has a semi-interest in this sort of stuff, is definitely not going to be doing that sort of stuff. So having the logo there means that I can walk straight into the shop, glance at the packaging, because it's always going to be really prominent on the packaging, glance at the packaging and go, that's better than that one without it. On balance of probabilities, that's the one I will buy. And I've made a very small but nonetheless important contribution.
Yeah, I think that summarizes it well. I don't think there's anything I can add.
No.
So we'll...
so I guess time to say thank you for listening to today's episode of the Sustainability Scope. I have been Mike.
And I have been Alex.
And we shall see you next time.